A warning before we start. This case involves a murder scene that investigators are still arguing about years later, down to where a driver's license was sitting relative to the blood on the floor. What you're about to hear is disturbing. It's disputed. And as of this year, it still hasn't been settled by a court. Here's how it actually happened. Teresa Sievers grew up in Darby, Connecticut, and decided in the 6th grade that she wanted to spend her life saving people. She graduated valedictorian of her high school class. She finished medical school with honors, and by the time she completed her residency in Florida, they'd already named her Resident of the Year. In 2003, she married Mark Seavers, the brother of a close friend. By 2006, they'd built a life in Bonita Springs, a holistic medical practice called Restorative Health and Healing Center, 2 young daughters, and a reputation Teresa had earned patient by patient. One of her own patients later said she was like the Oprah Winfrey of Bonita Springs, that trusted, that loved. Behind closed doors, none of it was holding together. By the spring of 2015, Mark believed Teresa was preparing to leave him and take their daughters with her. He didn't have the money to fight her for custody in court. That single fear is what set everything else in motion. In May of 2015, Mark flew to Missouri for the wedding of a childhood friend, Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. Over the course of that weekend, in a handful of private conversations, Mark told Wright everything: the fear, the money, the marriage he couldn't hold on to. Wright didn't hesitate for long. There was only one way to fix this, he said. Teresa would have to die, and he wasn't offering out of friendship. According to court records, Wright agreed to take care of it for at least $100,000, a cut of Teresa's life insurance once it paid out. Mark said yes. Nobody at that wedding noticed one small detail that would matter enormously later. Wright and Mark looked enough alike, same build, same close-cropped hair, same wire-frame glasses, that people who knew them both sometimes had to look twice to tell them apart. It seemed like nothing. It would not stay nothing. Mark didn't just agree and walk away. He built the plan out in careful detail, 2 entirely different scenarios for how his wife could die. A staged burglary at the family home, or a staged mugging the following day at Teresa's own medical office. He left the choice to Wright, and in a detail that tells you exactly how carefully Mark was protecting himself, he told Wright one more thing. Don't tell me who you use. He wanted distance. He wanted deniability built in from the start. Wright already had someone in mind, a man named Jimmy Ray Rogers. At trial, Wright would explain exactly why he picked him, saying Rogers had been involved in other deaths, someone who'd actually go through with it. There was an older debt between the 2 men too. According to Rogers' own girlfriend, he owed Wright a favor from years back, and this murder was, in part, how that favor got settled. Mark and Wright didn't even talk about the plan on their real phones. They used prepaid burners that didn't come alive until the 2 men traded a code word on their regular lines first. If anyone ever pulled their normal phone records, there would be nothing to find. On June 27, 2015, Wright picked up a rental car in Hillsboro, Missouri, and collected Rogers. The GPS was already loaded with an address 1,100 miles away in Bonita Springs, Florida. They drove through the day and into the night, stopping once at a gas station where a security camera caught both of their faces. Neither of them thought twice about it. That footage would end up mattering more than either man could have guessed. They reached the Seavers house around 6 the next morning. Teresa wasn't home yet. She'd cut a family trip short to fly back alone and see patients the next day. Wright and Rogers let themselves onto the property, disabled the home security alarm, and left again, with hours still to kill. So they went shopping. A local Walmart, cameras rolling. A backpack, shirts, black towels, black shoes, wet wipes, a beverage cooler, a lockpicking kit. Then they drove to the beach and waited for the sun to go down, like 2 men killing time on any ordinary Sunday. That evening, Teresa Sievers walked off a plane at Southwest Florida International Airport, caught alone on the terminal cameras, heading home to a house that wasn't actually empty. She pulled into her own garage, gathered her luggage, and walked inside. What happened in the minutes after that would become the single most contested detail in this entire case, and years later, the physical evidence would raise questions nobody has ever fully answered. What isn't disputed is this. Teresa was beaten to death with a hammer, struck 17 times. The next morning, when she didn't show up to see patients, Mark, hundreds of miles away, called a family friend and asked them to check the house. That friend found her on the kitchen floor. The 911 call survives. She's dead on the floor. She's cold. Before we keep going, I want to stop here for a second. If this is already sitting heavy with you, that's exactly why we tell it. Every case on this channel is somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody who still matters to people grieving them years later. If you want to see more cases told this way, hit subscribe. And if this one's already got you, drop a like before we keep going. It genuinely helps stories like Teresa's reach the people who need to hear them. Now, back to what happened next. A week later, at Unity Church in Naples, the pews were full. Teresa's eldest daughter stood up to speak, and by every account in that room, she moved the whole church to tears. Mark, watching her, told the crowd his daughter was stronger than he was. Then he gathered himself and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. I was, and still am, the luckiest man in the world. Standing beside him the entire time, comforting the family, playing the part of a devastated friend supporting a devastated widower, was Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. Nobody in that church had any reason to hear either man's words as anything but grief. Hours later, investigators watching the property saw Mark throw computer equipment into a dumpster behind the medical office he'd shared with his wife. For nearly 2 months, the case went nowhere. Detectives had a body, a hammer, and almost nothing else. Mark's alibi was airtight, hundreds of miles away with his daughters. But something about him didn't sit right. He handed over his phone, then stopped cooperating entirely. There was the dumpster. Investigators started circling him quietly, long before they had enough to make an arrest. The break didn't come from forensics. It came from a girlfriend. Jimmy Rogers had confided in his girlfriend, Taylor Shoemaker, describing in detail using a hammer on a woman named Teresa Sievers. According to Rogers, Shoemaker didn't go straight to police out of civic duty. He later alleged she tried to use what she knew to squeeze money out of Wright first, threatening to go to police unless he paid her before she ever actually cooperated with investigators. When she finally did talk, the state ended up paying her for her cooperation too. A detailed defense attorneys have leaned on ever since to question how reliable any of this really was. Whatever her reasons, when police finally reached her, she didn't just talk. She walked them straight to the evidence: coveralls Rogers wore during the murder, pieces of a disassembled burner phone, all of it discarded in places only someone who'd actually been there would think to look. Investigators also went straight to the people closest to Wright. They asked his wife, point blank, whether she'd ever slept with Mark Seavers. Not that she knew of, she said, and she explained she'd been drunk the night before her own wedding, and that her husband and Seavers looked so much alike it was an easy thing to wonder about. Her own mother told detectives she'd had suspicions from the very start. Her daughter first admitted Wright had gone to Florida that weekend, then took it back days later. She also said the Wrights could never have afforded a trip like that on their own, not 2 rental cars, not the gas, not on what Curtis made. None of it proved an affair. But it was enough to make investigators look at Curtis Wright a great deal more carefully than they had before. And once they had his name, the digital trail Wright and Rogers left behind without realizing it did the rest of the work. GPS logs placed their rental car on the road to Bonita Springs and back, time-stamped to the hour. Cell towers corroborated it. The gas station camera and the Walmart footage put both their faces on the route. Prosecutor Cynthia Ross would later put it simply: this was a case where 21st century technology became vital in a way no confession ever could have been. Wright was arrested first. He denied everything at first. Then he broke and gave up Mark Seavers by name. Mark himself wasn't arrested until February 26, 2016, 8 months after his wife's murder, 1 week after Wright's final sworn statement landed on a prosecutor's desk. The Lee County Sheriff stood in front of reporters that day and said it plainly: "We were after Mark Seavers. We got our man." Mark was indicted that May. What followed was almost as ugly as the murder itself, in a different way. Mark's own daughters became the subject of a custody fight run from inside a jail cell. He pushed for his own mother to take them instead of Teresa's, and jail phone recordings played in court showed him coaching her to fight for it and telling the girls not to trust their maternal grandmother. He lost. By November 2016, permanent custody went to Teresa's mother, and it stayed there. The 2 girls grew up calling their grandmother Mimi. Whatever this case took from them, They were raised, in the end, by someone who'd loved their mother her whole life too, in a home built around keeping at least that much intact. From there, 3.5 more years passed before any of the three men actually stood in front of a jury. It wasn't unusual for a case this size. The evidence alone ran into thousands of pages of phone records, GPS data, financial documents, and forensic reports, and both sides spent years working through it before either man was ready for trial. Roger's own attorneys initially refused to waive his right to a speedy trial while evidence was still being turned over, arguing the state hadn't finished disclosing everything it had. Mark's side did waive it, buying time neither man's defense would end up using particularly well when the moment finally came. Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. took his plea deal, guilty to second-degree murder, 25 years, in exchange for testifying against both Rogers and Mark. At his own sentencing, moments before the judge signed off, Wright turned to Teresa's mother and said, "I wish there was a way to change what happened, but I can't. That will be with me for the rest of my life. I'm sorry." Jimmy Rogers went to trial that October and was convicted of second-degree murder, life in prison. He'd actually been acquitted of the top charges, first-degree murder and conspiracy, the same charges Mark was about to face. He simply hadn't been able to testify at Mark's trial that November. His own case was still unresolved at the time, and taking the stand risked incriminating himself. Mark went to trial that November, pleading not guilty, with Wright now sitting in the witness box as the state's star witness against him. Mark's defense had two angles, and neither one was an alibi. First, they went after Wright's credibility directly. Wright had never been given a polygraph as part of his plea deal, something the state could have required and didn't, and defense attorney Michael Mummert hammered that point hard in closing arguments, asking jurors whether they'd feel differently about everything Wright had said if he'd had to take one. Second, Mummert argued Wright was lying, not to protect himself, but to protect his own wife. There was evidence Angela Wright had approached witnesses and pushed them to change their statements, and the defense argued the state could have charged her for it and chose not to in exchange for her husband's full cooperation. Mummert even went after the investigation itself, questioning the credibility of how the Lee County Sheriff's Department had built the case. Prosecutor Hamid Hunter answered every point in his closing, walking the jury through the corroborating evidence, GPS, cell towers, surveillance, that backed Wright's account regardless of his credibility. It wasn't a small fight. It still only took the jury a little over 4 hours to convict Mark Seavers anyway. In December of 2019, the verdict came back. First-degree murder, conspiracy, guilty on both counts. Days later, that same jury recommended the death penalty. A local Fort Myers news station filmed the moment, and that footage has since been watched more than 14 million times on YouTube. On January 16, 2020, Judge Bruce Kyle formally sentenced Mark to death. Teresa's mother, Marianne Groves, stood in that courtroom and told the world, "We will miss her every day for the rest of our lives." Mark told the court he was innocent and heartbroken, and called Teresa his soulmate. Strip the case down to its foundation, and here's what it actually rested on. The only evidence that directly tied Mark Seavers to a conspiracy to kill his wife was Curtis Wright's word, given as part of a deal that took a life sentence off the table. Everything else, the GPS, the cell towers, the Walmart footage, proved Wright and Rogers were in Florida and committed the murder. None of it on its own proved Mark ordered any of it. Mark wasn't even charged until Wright flipped and named him. The entire case against him was built on the testimony of the man who swung the hammer. That should have been the end of the story. For 6 years, it basically was. Everything you've just heard is the version a jury believed in 2019, and it's the version nearly every article about this case still tells today. But there's a second version, and it didn't come out of nowhere. If you're the kind of person who likes untangling a case that isn't as settled as it looks, tell me in the comments what you think really happened, once you've heard both sides. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because this case is still moving. Here's something almost nobody covering this case mentions. At the original 2019 trial, Mark's own defense tried to raise the question of whether he and Wright had a sexual relationship. The prosecution objected. The judge agreed it wasn't relevant unless someone was actually willing to testify to it under oath, and at the time, nobody was. The jury that convicted Mark Seavers never heard a word of it. But here's what almost nobody knows either. Nearly 5 years before any hearing was ever granted, Jimmy Rogers sat down and wrote a 6-page letter to Mark Seavers' own mother against his legal team's advice. He'd already started telling a different story quietly, years before the world would hear it. That story finally reached a courtroom in October of 2025 when Mark's post-conviction team, after filing 163 pages of new claims across 6 separate points, was granted an evidentiary hearing. Rogers took the stand and said it under oath, on the record. "I was never told by Curtis Wainwright that our trip to Florida was to kill Dr. Teresa Sievers." According to Rogers, there was no plan waiting inside that house. He claims he had no idea what the trip was actually for. The state didn't let that stand unchallenged. Prosecutors pulled out the letter Rogers had written years earlier and picked it apart line by line. "In the letter, you didn't mention that you were in Florida too, did you?" the state asked. "Without reading the letter, no," Rogers answered. "You didn't even mention in the letter you were with Wayne, did you?" "To my knowledge, again, I can't recollect," he said. A story that left out the fact that he was even there is not an easy story to trust. Then came the forensic testimony, and this is where the case gets genuinely strange. Analysts told the hearing that Teresa had suffered a brutal hammer attack, with most of her injuries occurring while she was already down low, not standing. They testified the pry marks on the side door didn't necessarily look like forced entry at all, and they questioned the original burglary theory outright, since valuable items had been left sitting out in the open. On the physical evidence Rogers claimed proved his innocence, the coveralls, he says, were thrown out a car window and never entered the house. No blood or DNA was found on them at all, though fibers recovered from them matched fibers found in Teresa's hair. No blood turned up on the backpack either, and the DNA on its strap couldn't be matched to anyone specific. Investigators were careful to note that a lack of DNA doesn't mean the items weren't used. It just means the evidence couldn't prove it either way. 2 details stood out above everything else. Teresa's purse was found in a location that didn't match what Wright had testified to at the original trial, a hole in the very account that convicted Mark Sievers. And her driver's license was found sitting on top of the blood at the scene, not underneath it, not soaked into it. On top of it. To investigators, that single detail suggested something had been moved or staged after the killing was already done by someone who came back into that kitchen once it was over. Mark's own trial attorney, Michael Mummert, took the stand at that same hearing and said something that should stop you cold. He testified he'd come to believe Wright wasn't just the middleman Mark hired. He believed Wright was infatuated with Mark, obsessed with him in a way that traced back to their childhood friendship, and that Wright may have been the true driving force behind what happened, not merely someone following orders. Testimony described a secret phone Wright allegedly used, trips to Florida his own wife wasn't fully told about, a relationship that, according to what was said in that courtroom, went far beyond friendship, the exact question a jury was never allowed to hear back in 2019. And there's a detail in the physical evidence nobody has ever explained. At the original trial, Wright testified Rogers delivered the final blow using the claw end of the hammer. The autopsy shows no wound pattern consistent with a hammer's claw at all. One of the 2 men who killed Teresa Sievers told a jury a version of events the evidence doesn't support, and 6 years later, that gap is still sitting there, unexplained. The hearing also dug into how thin Mark's original defense really was. His own mother, Bonnie Sievers, testified she'd met with one of his attorneys only twice and mostly dealt with a legal assistant instead. She said she was never properly prepared for her own testimony and found the entire concept of what the defense wanted from her confusing. She'd helped put together a slideshow of Mark's life for the jury. She testified he'd had a normal, loving childhood, a stable home, and was, in her words, a caring father his daughters loved. The defense team, it turned out, had wanted her to suggest something traumatic had happened to Mark growing up. She refused because she said it wasn't true. There's one more detail that undercuts the original trial, and it isn't a matter of opinion, it's on the record. Before that 2019 trial even began, Mark stood in front of Judge Kyle and acknowledged, in open court, that his own attorneys, Michael Mummert and Gregory Masore, didn't appear to meet the state's requirements to handle a death penalty case at all. He went to trial with them anyway. The state's response to the 2024 motion, filed by Senior Assistant Attorney General Christina Pacheco, doesn't deny any of that. Instead, it argues Mark chose to proceed with that legal team knowing the risk, and that choosing to go forward doesn't prove his defense was actually ineffective, or that a better legal team would have changed the outcome. Mark's post-conviction attorneys, Megan Montagno, Julissa Fontan, and Teresa Hall, filed that motion in September of 2024. The state's 40-page response came that November. A hearing followed in January of 2025. And by October, Rogers was on the stand telling a very different story than the one he'd told in 2019. Mark's own stepmother put it more bluntly in a statement she gave reporters herself. "Mark is innocent," she said. "I am sick at heart with the injustice of his conviction." She isn't the only one still fighting. As of this year, Mark's legal team continues pursuing every available appeal, which is, by the way, the normal pattern in Florida capital cases. Attorneys who work these cases will tell you that almost every death row inmate exhausts every possible avenue before anything is considered truly final. None of this proves Mark Seavers is innocent. A jury already heard evidence once and didn't believe the story he told. Mark's team even asked to see the original autopsy photographs and x-rays again, hoping they'd support the new account. The medical examiner's office fought the request, and a judge sided against releasing them. In February of 2026, the same judge who sentenced him dismissed Mark's motion to overturn the conviction outright. A month later, a request to rehear that decision was rejected too. As of the most recent hearing this year, Mark Seavers remains on death row, and his legal team is expected to take this to a higher court next, the same way they did back in 2022, when the Florida Supreme Court rejected all 18 arguments raised on his first direct appeal and upheld the conviction in full. Here's the honest complication in all of it. If Rogers is telling the truth now, an innocent man is sitting on death row based almost entirely on the word of a man who's already proven he'll lie to protect himself, whichever version happens to be more convenient at the time. And if Rogers is lying now, for reasons of his own, then a guilty man's legal team has spent a fortune of public money chasing a fantasy, and Teresa's family has had to relive the worst day of their lives for nothing. Both of those things can't be true. As of today, nobody outside that courtroom knows for certain which one is. Teresa Sievers spent her life trying to heal people. Whether the man who ordered her death, or possibly didn't, ever gets a final, undisputed answer is still being decided, right now, in a Florida courtroom. When that appeal resolves, we'll be back with the update. If you want to be here when that happens, subscribe and turn your notifications on. Let me know in the comments which version of that night you believe, and what you think Mark Seavers actually deserves. And if this case affected you the way it affected all of us putting it together, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.